that I've posted the agenda. For anyone who's just joining, we'll go ahead and get it posted again. First, we can just start off with some introductions. So for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Adam Cole, one of your CEMA business reps. We also have another one of our reps on the call here, you'll see.
Hey, Zeb Feldman, Senior Business Rep for CEMA.
Great. And I'm scanning here. I don't see that we have any board members. We usually have them give a quick intro as well, but we'll go ahead and get started. So for the agenda today, it's going to be particularly budget-centric with an eye towards layoffs. I think those are definitely the calls that I know myself and Zeb are getting on a daily basis. And we've broken that down into a few different topics. So first, we'll give just a kind of general update on the state of the county budget as far as we're aware and as we've been dissecting it with a particular attention paid to health and hospital. After that, we want to discuss just kind of general best practices for CEMA folks, what we should be keeping in mind with the possibility of layoffs on the horizon. And towards that end, we're going to take a look at, I know folks have been following along with what's happened over at the court with the package that CEMA was able to negotiate for its members over there. That's the discussion folks have seen around the golden handshake. We'll talk about what that can be used insofar as a guide for us over at the county. And then at the end, we'll have a particular update for folks keeping track of the grievance process, which is now proceeding to arbitration for issues around contract implementation specifically, and most notably with the bonus for our nurses, and then for a smaller group with folks who were transferred in kind of a window to get both SEIU and CEMA's deal there. Okay, so jumping into the county budget. For anyone who is particularly interested in reviewing it and might not have known where to find it, I'm going to go ahead and post in chat where you can find the current recommended budget for the county. Be aware it's an extremely lengthy document. It's 600 or 700 pages long. The most important thing to know about this is that this is a temporary document. This is not going to be the final budget. We've known for some time there was already going to be a revision in August or September when the Board of Supervisors returns from recess. The initial hope, I think, around that was that when this budget was being drafted, it was unknown. You know, we didn't know 2 months ago where we were going to be this month, and we don't know where the state of the economy is going to be 2 months from now. So the expectation is that there's going to be another budget. There's a few things hanging out there with regards to how much economic recovery can the county expect. How much support from the feds or the state can the county expect? Are promised COVID reimbursements actually expected to come through, et cetera? And with those issues hanging out there, we've known for some time this wasn't going to be a final budget. Secondarily, it lasted even a shorter period than we thought because there's been a subsequent couple of meetings with county executives where there's already new numbers around reductions being thrown around. So before we get to those, we'll do a quick overview of what's contained in this budget. So as far as this first tentative budget is concerned, things don't look too bad for CEMA. There's a small number of CEMA positions that are being cut, less than 10, and mostly vacancies. On the other hand, we can see a somewhat more substantial number of positions being cut from public safety, justice, in particular, Department of Corrections, probation, and the sheriffs. And those are mostly, for example, sheriff's deputies. So whether the reason for the particular targeting in the budget there, we can see somewhat steeper cuts in those areas than we can see elsewhere. You know, it's possible that's the politically expedient thing to do. There might be some other reason we don't know for sure yet, but what is evident is that there's definitely a stronger hit on public safety and justice than on the other areas. That's somewhat concerning for CEMA. We do have members over there. So far, they've been insulated from those cuts, but it's absolutely something that we will need to be keeping an eye on as the budget moves forward. And of course, we always hope to minimize and insulate insofar as possible our positions and our members from any additional cuts that we see. With regard to HHS, there's a few important things to note there. There's a significantly larger general fund draw coming towards the hospitals than in past years. Our understanding is that part of that is to account for, of course, there's been a significant loss in revenue due to COVID, but you can see in kind of the first half of the budget, there's also a significant significant amount of money that you'll be receiving due to COVID. However, it's unclear right now to the county when exactly a lot of that money is going to come through. So on the possibility that it comes late, doesn't materialize at all, there's that kind of backstop there for health and hospital for the time being. That's why it may look like, despite not having any loss, there's still a greater general fund draw for health and hospital. So it's a good level of support being given by the county to the health and hospital system. Insofar as we can tell, it's good to see. No major cuts over at health and hospital, and that's something, of course, that we're happy to see. But I'm going to go ahead and screen share. That's kind of the overview that exists in the budget right now. You know, minimal impact, but unfortunately, that's going to be the first of many cuts. Not many, but first of at least more than one cut. And this is what's being discussed right now. So if you guys can see a screen share. This is what was passed around in an executive meeting. It's, you know, a little bit kind of back of the napkin tablecloth. Numbers on here, I wouldn't expect this necessarily to be final, but this is what's being discussed right now, and it's substantial cuts. So as we can see, it's another 8.3 million for most departments. HHS being larger and kind of comprising some sub areas as well, is 30 million. So this is what we have an eye on as we're going to move into August and September, and expect to see that new budget come out from the county. I think those are kind of the numbers that are being discussed right now. I think we'll expect to see something similar to that as we get out of July. That being said, what does that mean for CEMA, and what are we doing for the moment? So of course, the goal here is going to be to insulate and protect CEMA positions as much as possible in every single department. So what did we do over at the court, for example? So the court is a good step ahead of where we are over here. Their budget cut came out fairly quickly, came out from Sacramento. They had a 10% budget cut to their funds. You know, it's a significantly more simple budget than we see over at the county. So they were able to move forward fairly quickly. So what we were able to negotiate in that case, and Zeb did a fantastic job on this, was there's multiple things that we can look at, you know, hopefully before we get to layoffs, and the court likely won't be seeing any layoffs. So you'll see a survey come out fairly soon from CEMA.
Our unit at the court will not. They just announced.
Sorry, yes, our not the court overall. CEMA in particular, due to some of the good work that Zeb and his team over there were able to put together. But there's multiple options when we're looking at significant budget cuts, and the first one we jump to is usually not going to be layoffs, right? So for those folks that have been through recessionary periods before and public employers, you know, there's a range of things that we can look at and bargain over as a union to try to address budget cuts separate from layoffs. And we've talked about those in some other recent site meetings, and we're going to continue to discuss them. We want to make sure folks understand or are informed. Because like I said, you'll see some surveys coming out shortly about these. So those range of options that you'll be asked to consider will be, on the first hand, you'll see furloughs. That's something that CEMA did, you know, last time during the recession. It's something that was up for consideration over at the court. You could look at, you know, foregoing increases in currently bargained contracts. Generally not something we as staff would recommend, but it is a valid option that, you know, for some reason that was the will of the unit, folks could consider it. Softer options like forestalling planned increases that are coming in contracts, also not necessarily something we would recommend. Other options like, you know, voluntary reduction in work hours, long-term unpaid leaves of absences for those who want to take them. Then, of course, most popularly, I think we've seen the possibility of something along the lines of a golden handshake that could take different forms, looking at, you know, possibly years of service, 1 to 2 years. Or a one-time cash payment. It's not something that you know we'd be able to assure at this point is definitely going to happen in the court, but the county is definitely incentivized to get folks to retire during times like these. So I think it's something that definitely we'd be able to push for and could probably expect to see some movement on. So those are kind of the range of things before we get to layoffs. And then beyond that, there's layoffs. And then if we're looking at layoffs, there would first be, well, how many positions are we able to free up? How many vacancies do we have remaining still, et cetera? You expect to see some reshuffling. And then through that stage, you'd eventually be looking at what folks would consider, I think actual layoffs with people actually walking out the door. So where we're at right now with this budget, none of those things need to be contemplated. But based off where I think we can all expect things are going to go, those are things that we are going to need to start contemplating. We're expecting that the county is going to reach out once the next budget comes around in that August or September time frame to start bargaining with unions about what the impact of these additional cuts are going to be. And we could see cuts on that document in two waves, right? A first one and a second one. We know the county has already reached out to some unions. What we understand is that it's currently just those public safety and justice unions. As we can see in the current budget, they really are the more impacted ones. So the county needed to reach out to start discussing those, 20 or so positions that were already being cut. We're not there yet. We're losing some vacancies and possibly one or two occupied positions, but that's all we have in the current budget. So we're not there yet. So that survey that comes out from CEMA, what you'll see is it'll be, something along the lines of a ranked choice, and it'll say, these are the options that we can contemplate as a union when the county approaches us to, come asking for money. What is your preference? Is your preference, furloughs? Is your preference delaying a pay cut or a pay increase, et cetera? And that's the information that Zeb and myself and the board and Rebecca will be taking forward into those negotiations to get the best deal we can for everyone. So I want to pause there. I know I just talked for about 15 minutes straight and see if there's any questions before we talk a little bit more about kind of what best practices are with regards to things we need to keep in mind as layoffs are a possibility.
And just as a reminder, maybe Adam went over it before I hopped on. If so, I apologize. I know we have a lot of people on the call. This call is being recorded, which it was published in the chat, and also our convention for these. Everybody has the ability to unmute themselves, but traditionally, when we have more than 50 people, we have more than 100 on this call. Please just post the comments to everybody in chat. It's in the middle of your bar. I think everyone's familiar with Zoom by now. In the middle of your bar at the bottom of the screen. And please, 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 unless it's absolutely necessary that it remain confidential, post it to everybody so everyone can read along as we're answering those questions. Looks like we got a quiet group.
So that's something that would need to be specifically contemplated. So for folks who are on the phone, we had a question of how would furloughs impact people who have voluntary reduction in work hour. So for those folks who aren't familiar, furloughs are effectively voluntary reductions in work hours. They function pretty much the same way. So a furlough would look at, for example, not just throwing out a number, you're going to have a Friday off every other week, and that's going to be an unpaid day. That would be a 10% effective furlough. With voluntary reduction in work hours, we have something similar where folks could have a 10 or 20% reduction to the amount of time that they're working. And there's no specific contemplation of how that would overlap. Would folks who are already working VRWH be exempted from furloughs? I think that's likely something that we would contemplate if we were looking at furloughs, because that person has effectively already opted into a furlough ahead of time. That being said, this is also an opportunity. Sometimes folks are particularly interested in furloughing. If you have, side business you'd like to devote more time to, if the time off is advantageous for your childcare situation, whatever it may be. I think the best case scenario would be an additional opt-in. If folks who are VRWH would like additional time off, they could opt into a higher level. That would be ideal. But for sure, we'd want to look at exempting folks where they don't want to be hit with that double whammy. It was a good question, Diana.
And just so folks are aware, I think, Adam, you already posted it, the court document. In the court document, this precise question was contemplated, and it was that the furloughs would be in addition to VRWH. Of course, VRWH allows you to voluntarily, it's called voluntary, right, pull it back. So if you learned, oh, wait a minute, I have to take 10 furlough days. Well, I can't afford that loss of pay. Okay, I'm reducing my VRWH would be an appropriate reaction to that. But as Adam says, it's something that's much as the next question is, it's negotiable, and we would want to talk specifically about it at the bargaining table, and we would contemplate that question. I see Jim has joined us. If you want to introduce yourself, Jim, I think you're the e-board representative for the call.
Hello,
Jim.
I'm Jim Piazza. I'm your CEMA treasurer. I'm also a IT manager here in HHS facilities. So
I don't know if
welcome,
you should
everyone.
be taking the call sitting in front of the hospital there, Jim. Doesn't seem like the best place.
Well, you know, this way I'm social distancing.
There you go.
I see.
We had a question from Andrew about would we have the discretion to when and how we'd use furloughs. That's something that's entirely up to bargaining, Andrew. I've negotiated furloughs in the past where it was just arbitrarily decided what the days were going to be for each person. There's a particularly good system that was agreed upon over at the court where they effectively have, similar to a vacation bank, it's a bank of furlough days. So that the pay loss is spread equitably out over the pay periods for the rest of the year. But then you're allowed to use those furlough days kind of similarly to how you would use vacation in a way that, you know, it makes sense for your work and your life. That's a great system they have over there. You know, I think we'll definitely, if the will of the membership is to look at furloughs, we'd want a similar system over here. And I think it makes sense for both the employer and the employees in those cases because it's less arbitrary. Okay. So I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of the layoff process, best practices to keep in mind as we're aware that's, oh, sorry, we got a question from Diptian. Let me address this real quick. So the question is, are furloughs implemented across the board? That would depend, Dipti, not necessarily. It's not an inherent part of agreeing to furloughs. That's something that would need to be looked at. For example, we have budget units that are insulated from the general fund for one reason or another, whether it's roads and airports or Valley Health Plan, that just have separate funding streams. Last time the county did furloughs, I think I wasn't here at the time, of course, but my understanding is that kind of as a sign of solidarity and equity amongst departments, everyone was furloughed to the same degree, whether or not the budget necessitated it. That doesn't mean that money flows into the general fund that you saved over at the library, for example. It just would go into their reserves. So it doesn't really help the situation. Well, it doesn't help the financial situation. Maybe it helps the morale situation, or maybe it hurts it. That's something that CEMA's board's currently considering, and that's something that you'll see in the survey as well. Is that something that we would want to see this time again, or would we want to try to insulate departments that are financially insulated? Yep. We had a question from Jose asking, do we think it likely the county will extend a golden handshake to those at HHS? I think it's very likely that we'll see some kind of retirement incentive. I don't know that we'll see what folks are considering as the golden handshake, the years of service. Maybe not on that. You know, it's something that we'll learn more as the county reaches out to us and we start to bargain over that. But there's definitely a strong incentive in times like these on the part of the employer to incentivize folks to retire. It makes financial sense for them to make that offer. So I think it's likely that we see some kind of retirement incentive. In the two common options, right, would be putting those years of service on or making some kind of one-time cash payment as an incentive. Okay. Any other questions before we? Okay.
No. Barbara, I can answer that. So we're in a little bit of an advantage here. We, meaning the county unit, because so much research has had to be done through PERS and what's legal with PERS extensions of years of service and service credit and purchasing airtime and so on, especially after the 2013 PEPRA changes. So fortunately, the county unit is advantaged. Unfortunately, it's for a bad reason, right? Which is that we're looking at budget cuts. So will the county look at employees purchasing years of service? No. There is the possibility for the employer to offer, as Adam was saying, a golden handshake in terms of years of service, and PEPRA can offer it in a 1 or 2 year increment. 1 or 2 years, those are the only two options. And the employer has to purchase it on behalf of the employee. I'm sure we could negotiate some kind of a cost savings method or cost sharing method if that needed to happen. Probably not, though. It would probably be borne by the employer.
And what folks want to keep in mind here is that the entity that administers the pension is separate from the county, right? So when we say it's not an option, it's not because the county doesn't want to. It's because CalPERS, the entity that administers the pension, is legally prevented because of the PEPRA legislation from allowing its constituent members to do differently. So that's just kind of defining the field of play for us. Here are the possible options that we can bargain that are legal since PEPRA. We had a question from Trivia asking what happens to vacation accruals. Could you clarify that? Do you mean if, for example, someone was to take a long unpaid leave of absence as part of a layoff package, or if you're furloughed? Okay, so you'll maintain, but when you're on an unpaid leave of absence, which is what a furlough is, you don't accrue. Yeah. You would also normally, something worth mentioning at this point that we can see over in the court, for example, is that folks will know that anyone here who's been on a long leave of absence that is bled over into that unpaid time will know they end up getting saddled with the full cost of their benefits. Something we were able to get over at the court was for anybody who wants to opt into a I'll be gone for the rest of the fiscal year unpaid kind of deal. The court's going to continue to pick up the court side of the medical benefits. But things like that, things that improve the normal status quo of what it means to be on an unpaid leave of absence need to be specifically negotiated. Normally when a furlough day is an unpaid leave of absence, if you were to take it in a chunk, it's the same way. You'd be picking up the cost of the benefits, you don't accrue, et cetera. Anything above and beyond that would be up for us to specifically negotiate. Yeah, Michelle. So we had a question here. Does the contract consider, and the contract meaning CEMA's MOU, does CEMA's MOU consider contractors when we're coming up on layoffs? Sort of. So when we're looking at layoffs, it's a mandatory subject of bargaining for the county. What's very explicit in the contract is the order of non-CEMA folks being eliminated before CEMA folks, and that would be, provisional and unclassified positions, for example, and then probationary positions before we got to ours. The county doesn't have any strict obligation to cut contracts prior to cutting positions when they come up on layoffs, but that's part of what our job is, and if and when we are looking at layoffs, part of what we'll be looking at members to help us identify are there contracts out there that are being inappropriately maintained at the expense of staff that need to be raised by CEMA as a, hey, you're saying you need to cut 3 positions from this department, no, cut 1 position in this contract that will let you continue to maintain 2 employees. That's kind of the normal bargaining that goes into coming up on layoffs, is trying to identify those other cost savings or efficiencies, and that's part of that is the responsibility of the union to raise those issues. Of course, we've seen that, at VMC, for example, they've already cut, 30 million of contracts before COVID even hit. And I know some of our folks are continuing to look at and evaluate and, trim there. So it's something that the employer is looking at if and where they've missed something, or they're particularly trying to shelter something. That becomes our responsibility to identify that and raise it then. Okay. Dipti was asking if we could get numbers on how many folks opted in for particular deals over at the court. I would leave that to you, Zeb.
Yes, we can. Here's the sort of asterisk to that, is there are 3 dates. I did post the document in chat that people have to notify the court of choosing to take advantage of those different offerings. One is fast approaching in the next 2 days, which is noticing the court that they are separating, meaning taking the golden handshake. The other 2 dates are a little bit further out, which are if they want to take care, do the VRWH, voluntary reduced work hours, or if they want to take that long-term leave. So far, the numbers as of Monday, which because we're right at the cusp, these could be out of date, are about 12 people have taken the voluntary, and I'll explain the total number of people. It's 120 people in the court unit. So 12 is not a small number, right? 12 people have taken the voluntary separation, golden handshake. 2 have taken the long-term leave, and 5 have taken the voluntary reduced work hours. Those numbers will be shored up, and I think we can get a final tally probably by the, let's say the 22nd or so. And we're happy to share that information, both with the court and also, of course, with the county, and translate it to percentages.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. I think we hit all those questions there. I'm gonna start discussing the next piece. Any other questions that come in, we'll tackle. We're still going to be talking about layoffs, broadly speaking.
Let me address Ms. Castillo's question. So Kathy, no, I am not saying we can, neither Adam or I or anyone in CEMA is saying we can have the same deal as the court. The county happily is in much better budgetary shape and has access to revenue and rainy day funds and one-time funds and can unencumber resources, move them around, much more resources and wealth than the court has. If the budget continues to deteriorate in the county will likely offer something similar to what the court had, but we would have to renegotiate it. We can't just say, we did this over at the Superior Court, therefore it's in force at the county. Like it's a separate employer. We might use that as a template if that's what the CEMA membership wants at the county, but we'd try to get that or something similar. Again, it would vary because it's a different unit.
Yeah, and for folks who didn't know the history, the court used to be administered by the county, and when it split off, CEMA retained the unit. It just we have 2 separate contracts now, two separate units within CEMA that exist now, subsequent to the court being spun off into its own administrative entity. Okay, so what should we be keeping in mind with the possibility of layoffs on horizon? And to do just a quick reminder on what the layoff process looks like for folks. We're getting a lot of questions about this. This wasn't something that we were hitting too much on other recent site meetings, and I know we didn't hear at least 2 months ago. Not wanting to panic folks, but now that we've seen some of the budget cut numbers, we just want to make sure, and we're getting calls frequently. We want to just do a review again on what that process looks like, so folks are aware, and so that you can make the best decisions with regards to is now a good time to transfer, for example, things like that. So the first thing is that keep in mind, and I'll get it posted in chat in a second, but we do a deeper dive on these topics and a review of the contract that we did that's posted up on YouTube after the most recent contract was settled. For anyone who wasn't able to make it on those calls, we didn't just hit the topics that had been changed in the contract, but we went through and discussed in detail and took questions on every single section in the contract, kind of grouped by type. So folks are absolutely welcome to go pull those videos up and do a look through on that as well when they have questions. You're also, of course, you can reach out to us anytime. But to do a kind of briefer overview of what that section means for folks. So when the county's contemplating layoffs, there's a couple things that we need to pay particular attention to in the contract and that you'll want to be aware of. The first is how seniority is handled within CEMA. The second is going to be the order of layoff, how that works. And then the third is what happens if someone receives a layoff notice or is impacted by a layoff. So for that first piece, it's a question that we're getting a lot. How does seniority work in CEMA? Seniority in CEMA works based on the date you were hired into a coded position with the county. That doesn't need to be a CEMA position. It just needs to be a coded position with the county. So if you were previously in an SEIU position for 10 years and then you promoted up into CEMA and now you've been in a supervisor manager position for 5 years, you will have 15 years of seniority. Someone who is the same manager position that you are, came directly in from the outside 10 years ago, will have 10 years of seniority. So you need to add up the time from when you first began in that coded position with the county. The only other wrinkle to this is going to be that the contract specifically contemplates when the county acquires another entity, which isn't normally relevant, but now particularly is because the county just acquired 2 hospitals. And what it stipulates there is that you get seniority credit for any time that you had at that agency, effectively, even though the seniority wasn't something that was referred to over there, but your seniority date is based on the higher date you had with that entity prior to acquisition by the county. And that's particularly in there because, you know, in the event that we were in a situation like we're in right now, where there's an acquisition followed shortly by a recession and a layoff situation, that new organization would be completely denuded of staff in that layoff environment. So it's some protection there. The seniority based on time with the employer is something that I've seen commonly in management contracts in other counties that I've worked at. And part of what that does is it offers assurance and protection that you're not exposing yourself to a dangerous situation by promoting into that supervisor manager position. If your seniority went back to 1 day after accepting a manager position, it would be something to consider. You know, it would be a disincentive to promote, right? And so that's part of protecting that. Sorry, just answering a quick question. Okay, so that speaks to seniority. The second piece is what does order of layoff look like in the contract? So order of layoff is called out in three levels. So first you'd shed provisional positions. Secondarily, you'd shed probationary positions, and then third, you would start to look at full-time coded positions, or part-time, but coded positions with the county. So what that order means is if the employer identifies that we need to eliminate, say, 2 program managers from health and hospital system, we are first going to identify provisional program managers. And then we will look at inverse order of seniority. So amongst that group, who has the least seniority? And then that person would be impacted. If you exhaust that group and you still have X number of program managers, you would then move on to probationary positions. You would exhaust that group. And then if you still have a remaining need for layoffs at that point, then you would move on to full-time folks. So that's the kind of initial level of protection that you would see there. So then for someone who receives a notice, what does that mean? Colloquially, we have this term referred to as bumping. So there's 2 things to keep in mind. So bumping, as folks would be, I think, thinking about it, breaks down into 2 separate terms within CEMA's contract. We have both in-placement and then we have displacement. So in-placement will be your first recourse if someone receives a layoff notice. And so what in-placement means is that you are able to look at any position throughout the county in the code that you're in and identify a vacancy that you're able to move into. It doesn't need to particularly be within your department or agency. It could be anywhere. Beyond that, you then have the ability to look at any previous codes that you held. So if you're currently a program manager 2 and you used to be a program manager 1, you will then also have the right to look at any positions in which you previously held status. And then third, beyond that, you're able to look at lower level positions. So say you came from management analyst to program manager 2. You would also then be able to look at program manager 1 just as a code in the line of succession there. And that ultimately requires a vacancy though. And it's a possibility in this situation that there aren't going to be any vacancies or open positions because they have been eliminated for other budgetary reasons, right? So then beyond that, you have the ability to displace. The major difference with displacement is that you cannot displace across department or agency as easily as you can in place. So displacing is probably closer to what folks think of when they think of as bumping. So displacement would mean Zeb has 10 years of seniority and he's been identified for a layoff. I am in a different unit in the same department and I have 1 year of seniority. He would be able to occupy my position and displace me from that position, effectively being bumped out of the position. What that means is that even though Zeb's unit or department was the one that was hit with the layoff, that layoff then effectively transfers to me after he occupies my position. And then I'm in that same position that Zeb was, though I might have different particular criteria that apply to me, different previous positions held, different underlying status, et cetera. And then I would go through that same process of identifying, are there any vacancies for which I'm qualified and able to work? Or then below that, is there anybody that I'm able to displace? Okay, so there's a bunch of questions coming in. Let me try and tackle these. Was there one you wanted to jump on quick, Zeb, before I scroll up and read through?
Sure. So let's just take them in order. Dipti is saying, technically, if open positions are first to be cut, when you say open, Dipti, I assume you mean vacant funded. Vacant positions is what you mean when you say open. I assume there won't be anything vacant. How would in-placement work? So no, that not necessarily. So let me explain why. Let's say we'll use a very real world example. This is just an example, okay? I don't want to freak anybody out. TSS has, and I don't know if this is true, I'm making these numbers up. TSS has 5 vacancies in an architect, enterprise architect position. And they decide to cut 5 enterprise architect positions. Then all of them are eliminated, right? Now, let's pretend they cut 6 and there's now a person in one of those codes. Well, they could go to a vacant enterprise architect position that's somewhere else in the county. So just because one department cuts them, I realize enterprise architect's a bad example now, but just because one department cuts them doesn't mean that every department has cut those vacancies. Enterprise architect is a particularly poor example because I believe that only exists in TSS, but let's take a more generic one, management analyst. Every department everywhere in the county has a management analyst position. So just because TSS cut all of its vacant management positions and 2 people who occupied them, there are going to be vacant management analyst positions somewhere in the county, in all likelihood. And as Adam pointed out, because it's by department, different departments are going to have different vacancy counts.
Yeah, and then just to add on, there's multiple things that cause vacancies to come available as well during the layoff. That's part of the incentive the county has to offer those golden handshakes or incentive deals, is that those effectively free up positions for folks who were impacted by layoffs to move into. So I know it feels like in recessionary budget cutting times, it's hard to imagine moving into a vacancy. But from practical experience, I've administered a couple layoffs in my time on the employer side, and we can look at CEMA as an example here. During the 2008 recession, where if we can cast our minds back, that definitely felt like a pretty dire economic straits at the time. But my understanding is there were minimal, if any, CEMA folks that actually ended up walking out the door as a result of a layoff, who weren't either provisional or probationary. As a result of that layoff. There's generally a large shuffling around that you'll see during any first round of a layoff. If the state of a budget gets to the point where there's multiple successive rounds of layoffs, what that generally means is you've already shuffled the box sufficiently that everything's aligned in the correct order, and then you'd start to lose folks off the bottom. But usually in my experience, and what CEMA in fact saw during the last recession, is that if things can be contained with a single round of layoffs, generally most folks will be able to shuffle around, keeping in mind that there will be other things that are looked at as well. You know, some of that loss can be made up by furloughs or, you know, incentive folks to retire, et cetera. But of course, that's a little bit predictive. We're looking forward into uncertain times here. So another question from Shrivya. If we have a new code from ITCC, but that code does not exist in the department, can we go ahead and look at a previously held code? Yes. So you'll be able to look at any codes for which you held underlying status, which means you acquire underlying status in a position once you've worked 6 months in that position. And that effectively entitles you during a layoff period to look preferentially at those positions, which is that subsequent probationary period. For someone who is new in the county, you would have, you know, 9 months to get your first underlying status.
There's something with TSS also, and Zeb was very good at negotiating this. With TSS, if you were already in like an ITM 3 like me, right, I was IT manager 3, that doesn't exist anymore. So part of the negotiation with the ITCC, we could bump that to any of it within our series. So say I'm an IT manager now, and they eliminate my code, I could go to an IT supervisor if there was an opening, or go that. That's my understanding.
That's correct, and you raise an excellent point that it wasn't just me; it was everyone who was on the ITCC council. But we predicted at that time, although the county's budget was great, we predicted that there would come a day when there would be reductions, right? So we wanted to make sure that we were insulated from that. And you're correct; you can claim anything in the series that you are now in for ITCC only. On is asking a question about the acquired entity. Yeah, that's our understanding right now. We're looking into that further though.
Yeah, and I'll point you to the particular section of the contract where it talks about seniority for acquired entities. And this might be the first time that we're field testing that language. But yeah, that's our understanding of how it'll go into effect right now.
So I think that answers Daryl's question. I'm on Shannon Sears. Do you see that one? So here's what Shannon Sears asks. Are you saying that we can look at any position with less seniority for displacement, or only the last hired person? Okay, so displacement is very specific. That means that you have lost your current position. There's no place for you to in place to, meaning there's nothing that you meet the MQs for that's vacant. So you are bumping someone else out of their job. And yes, it means that you bump the least senior person. It's not anyone with lower seniority. It's the least senior person. So you would get one position. They'd say the least senior person that you can bump is Joe Blow in the planning department. And that's the position that you get. You don't get to choose anyone less senior than you. Hopefully that answers your question, Shani. Do you want to do Srividya? I apologize, Sri. I'm probably mispronouncing your name. So she writes,
that was the ITCC one that Jim
okay.
helped us answer.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I think the next question speaks into a little bit where we're going to transition. So real quick, I'm going to post that section for anybody who wanted to review it about transfer from other agencies. It's section 15.2 in our contract. Okay, so keeping in mind those are the rules that we're all going to be abiding by when we're looking at a possibility of layoffs. What does that mean for best practices now for folks? And so the biggest one to keep in mind is that the order of layoff specifies first provisional folks and then probationary. And probationary doesn't discriminate between the reason why you're on a probationary period. So the first thing that I would say is, sometimes folks will transfer into a provisional position even though they have a coded position with the county because it's in a department they want to work in. It's a foot in the door at TSS, and that's where you've wanted to be for some reason or another. And it'll likely, during expansionary times, we could expect that would turn into a full-time position down the line because, hey, we're always adding positions. Now is not the time to be doing that. So I would, if you're in a coded position, definitely a bad time to be transferring into a provisional position for any reason. Also possibly a bad time to be transferring, period. It's something you'll need to think about with your particular circumstances. And the reason for that is if you're someone who, say, has 10 years of seniority and you have a position that's come up and you're thinking of transferring into it, accepting a promotion, whatever it may be, if that position is impacted by a layoff, you will, one, be seen as a probationary employee, but two, that doesn't put you at a greater risk for exposure to losing your employment completely with the county, but it would just make it more likely that you'd be impacted by the layoff and therefore have to look at bumping around to a different position, either through in-placement or displacement. So it just means that you could be impacted and land in a place that you didn't want to land. If that's something you're okay with, then it's a risk you can take, but it's something we want to make sure that you're going into with your eyes open. The reason it doesn't risk your employment with the county is that at the end of the day, whether or not you'd retain a position or not is always going to be based on your seniority, right? So if you didn't have seniority to retain the previous position that you were in, you would have lost it regardless, or you could just move back to that position anyway. So that's why we say it doesn't risk your employment, but it does risk the possibility that you could be impacted by the layoff if that position is targeted as hey, we need to cut 2 supervising HSRs or something, and oh, look, low-hanging fruit, one of them is probationary, bam, we got that one. That's just often kind of how this is looked at as departments looking out and trying to figure out what positions they can cut. You want to go to the union with the fewest amount of actual cuts possible, and eliminating provisional and probationary positions means you have a lower ask when you get to that point. So it would just drop you then directly into having to go through that bumping around, in-placement, and displacing process. So that's the advice that we have for members right now. If you had a position you were considering, then there's something that's gotten through the exception committee. As far as a timeline, we of course can't make any promises. We're not the employer in the county. My personal expectation is that I don't think we're going to be looking at layoffs before the beginning of next year, if we do get to that point. So it's possible there's a window there for anybody who's currently probationary. I think it's likely that you'll definitely have time to pass that probationary period before we're looking at layoffs. So that's good. And if you're going to transfer, I would say do it ASAP. Do it immediately, so that you have more opportunity to get those 6 months out of the way before we have the possibility of looking at layoffs. The reason I would expect that kind of timeline is just that I think we're going to be seeing a revised budget in August. Maybe that then gets approved in September. The negotiating process usually takes a month, 2 months, and then the layoffs actually go into effect, all the bumping around. What that does is would push actual layoff notices pretty close to the holiday season. And at previous counties I've worked at and other employers, there's a strong disinclination to have layoffs land around the holidays. So I just think with the timeline, we'd likely be discussing layoffs this year if we get there, but they wouldn't be going into effect until the beginning of next year. That's my best assessment from where we're at right now. So there's a little window here, definitely for folks to pass out of that probationary period if that's what you're in right now. And you want to transfer, do it immediately, but my advice would be don't do it if it's not something that you think you really need to do. So there's a question from RB here. What do you do? And we got rid of TARD, RB, it's now walk. What do you do if you're walking into a position? Do you retain your permanent position? So as far as the layoff is concerned, the walk position it's not relevant that you're walking into a position. You inhabit the code that you actually inhabit. If you're a healthcare program manager 2 walking into a senior healthcare program manager 2, as far as the layoff process is concerned, you are that healthcare program manager 2. That senior position will be looked at as low-hanging fruit because it's a vacancy. So it's a position that could very well be eliminated. If it is eliminated, you're back in your HCPM 2. If for some reason we're looking at seniority and bumping rights and how all that applies, for all intents and purposes, you are the HCPM 2. You're just temporarily walking into those duties of the senior. So it's not a harm nor a benefit to be walking during this time. Yeah. Another question from Kathy was asking, so for those of us who were reclassed and are on probation, that means the entire group of us. Yeah, so something that we've gotten now that, and Kathy, I believe you were part of the case manager reclass there, which wrapped up kind of in February, I want to say. So I think you guys will definitely be finishing out those probationary periods before we're looking at layoffs. Something that we've been able to get in recent class studies from ESA has been an agreement to look at waiving those probationary periods where we've abolished the class as a result, the previous class as a result of the class study, which is what happened in that case manager class study, for example. It's something that as we go forward with more class studies, we're going to continue to push for to get that probationary period waived because of the possible negative impacts that being on that status could have during layoffs. So I don't think it's anything our nurse case managers need to worry about. You guys should be fine on the timeline based off what we're looking at right now. And regardless, it's because that was an example of a complete class being abolished and moved over. Even if, for example, we started tomorrow, I wouldn't see that as having any particular impact, because the relevant question is how does that place you differentially against your peers? And you're all then in that same group, which is effectively group number 2, right? So I wouldn't see any particular harm in that case, even if we were to start tomorrow. Regardless, you should finish out before we're done. For anybody currently going through a class study, we're doing our best to get those probationary periods waived. We've gotten agreement on a couple, at least, of our recent class studies to get those waived. And it's something that we're going to continue to push for as well. Okay. Another question. Went through the reclass. That sounds a little niche, Jennifer. If you want to give me an email or a call afterwards, we can jump into the particulars there about how that interfaced with provisional. I think I need a little more information to answer that. Okay.
I think you answered it, but did we address On's question here, asking about the provisional and probationary?
I didn't know.
Okay, so there's still a significant, I'm not clear what you're saying isn't your understanding. There's still a significant benefit on and everybody to being a permanent employee. Provisional and probationary people are dismissed first, right? So that's just the order. It's extra help, then provisional, then probationary, then full-time staff. So if in our earlier example of management analysts, if there's a probationary management analyst and they have to cut one person, then that's the probationary person is the first one to go before any permanent person is talked to. So same thing with provisional. Provisional is even before probationary. So I hope that clarifies that there still is an enormous advantage to being a permanent.
And yeah, so Ted, given the timeline, it would just be hard to expect. I think that we'll be able to give you a better timeline on when we could possibly expect a golden handshake, if that's something that we're able to agree upon with the county, once the county starts the process of reaching out to its non-public safety unions to start bargaining over impacts. Where we sit right now, I would say it's possible that we could reach a deal on that and let folks start opting into that this year. But it also couldn't be, and that's just something that right now that pace is going to be dictated by the county. They're the moving party and the ones that have to sort out how deep and where and how many positions are going to be affected by the cuts before they come to CEMA and say, all right, we've identified how big of a pot of money we're looking for. Now let's start to bargain over it. And that could they could reach out next week, or it could be 2 months. So I'm expecting probably they'll finish out the budget in August before they reach out for that conversation, but it's possible they don't. So hopefully we'll have more information next month for folks on a timeline we could expect for that. Yeah. Okay, so we got 5 minutes left. Our last agenda item is what Carlos raised here, which is an update on the grievance for the lump sum. So I want to tackle that. And then any other questions that are coming in, we'll of course, or I'll of course be happy to stick around and answer any further questions we had. But for our nurses who've been waiting patiently, I want to address that. So for folks who have been following along, of course, the origination of the issue is that the county felt that because nurses lost 8 months of pay as opposed to the 11 months that the rest of our folks lost, they didn't feel they were entitled to the lump sum payment in the contract, even though the contract language didn't specify any particular group being left in or excluded. So we initially sought an informal resolution as the contract dictates, weren't able to resolve it, filed a formal grievance. We got our answer back on that at the end of last week. We'd already been told verbally that the answer was going to be no, we can't find a resolution to this, you know, with the county without escalating it, but we needed that formal response in writing. So we got that formal response at the end of last week. On Friday, I believe we asked to strike for arbitrators. So where does that put us now? So the mechanism that we have to resolve issues in the contract, if just trying to, you know, escalate within the county and get them to follow their own contract language doesn't work, is to bring it to a third-party neutral arbitrator. This is something for folks who may have worked at other counties previously that don't have personnel boards, for example, might be more familiar with the arbitration process. That's generally kind of the terminus of the disciplinary process in those cases. The only other area you'll usually hear about binding arbitrations, you know, sometimes when you sign a contract, you opt into binding arbitration. Sometimes you hear about it in, you know, sports teams negotiations for their salary, those kind of things. What it is it exists as kind of a mechanism to prevent issues from going to court and reduce the burden on the court is how it was initially envisioned. So neutral arbitrators, it's a profession, and it's often ex-judges. You know, it's a pretty lucrative, you know, thing to get into once you've retired out of your normal career. Ex-judges, attorneys with a lot of experience, sometimes state mediators are able to get into it. But they exist as someone who both parties can agree upon an individual that they want to arbitrate and litigate their issue. Both parties appear before that individual, make their case. It proceeds kind of like a mini court hearing, you know, opening statements, calling witnesses, etc., presenting evidence. And then at the end of that process, both parties agree to be bound by whatever the decision is of the arbitrator. So the first part of that is striking for arbitrators. We have kind of a pot of acceptable arbitrators that are called out in our contract, one of the less interesting sections of the contract, but it's relevant now. So actually, we got an email back from the person in the county this morning that I actually haven't gotten to yet, but you know, hopefully we should have a date this week to do that striking for arbitrators. And what that is you each just take turns, you know, striking one arbitrator off the list one at a time until you both end up with someone in the middle. And then we'll be able to get that arbitrator scheduled to hear the case. As an expected timeline, in my experience, I've seen arbitrators take usually between 1 to 2 months to write decisions. This is a pretty straightforward and simple case. You know, there won't be a lot of witnesses. It'll be, you know, we'll probably have 1, maybe 2 people we'll have to put on to explain and discuss the issue and hit the key points. I would expect something similar from the county. It should absolutely be a 1-day arbitration, and then it'll be up to the arbitrator to make a decision. We are fairly confident with the contract language that we have. It's been reviewed by OE3's attorneys. They're similarly confident in the language, but this is the process that we have to go through to get that language enforced. So as a possible timeline, I would hope we'll have a resolution in 2 months. Worst case scenario, I think the longest I've ever waited for an arbitration decision was 6 months. That's pushing it. That's fairly unreasonable. But that's the longest I've seen one take. So hopefully we'll see a resolution soon. Worst case scenario, 6 months.
And my experience in the county for the arbitrations I've been with, usually we'll get some kind of a ruling within, 4 to 12 weeks. So 1 to 3 months. 6 I've heard of, I've never experienced in the county. So.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. So some questions here. Will SEMA communicate with members if the county reaches out? Yes, immediate. Well, on the next e-blast, you'll see it for sure. So once the county reaches out, you can think of it somewhat as a similar to contract negotiations and bargaining. We'll have updates for you guys similar to the way we had, fairly regular updates for folks during negotiations. This won't be a process that takes 11 months to figure out. But we'll have updates in that similar kind of vein. It's a process first where, the county being the moving party, they'll approach us and present and say, hey, SEMA, here's the facts, here's what we're looking at, this is what we need from you, and then make a case to argue why they've already done the most reasonable thing. We'll take that back, and it'll be some rapid but still lengthy vetting of all the information they present. We'll likely have information requests that we'll have to make based on departments that are being impacted. We'll be reaching out to members specifically in those departments for support, because we'll need to be identifying, hey, what are the particulars in this department that we need to be pointing out? Are there in fact lucrative contracts that are sitting out there that haven't been trimmed? Is this a department, or is this a position where if we lose it, it's got a 3-year time to fill, so this is just a dumb position to cut because once you're ready to spin back up, it's going to take an extra 3 years, all those kind of things. So this will be a process where impacted departments have a lot of opportunity for input and involvement in this process. And there will similarly be updates and communication coming out from us as that process moves forward. And I would generally, in my experience, and maybe Zeb, your experience here at the county differs, but when I've bargained layoffs with unions, it's about a 30-day process usually. That's been my experience.
Yeah, I would say so. The last time was an exception. It was before I transitioned to SEMA from SEIU. I believe SEMA made those negotiations in just a couple days. But the reason that it was so brief was that at that time, which I think our strategy will be different now, is that SEMA just wanted Me Too protection. So the document was really, here's what we agreed to, and Me Too, if anyone gets anything lesser. Lesser meaning better, right? Less of a furlough, less of a reduction, right?
We had a question from Trivia about reinstatement. So what reinstatement is that if we end up with a round of layoffs that result in people actually going out the door, then you get put on a rehire list. I think, does that last 2 years here at the county, Zeb?
Yes, that's correct. The rehire list is 2 years.
So what that means is that you're a senior management analyst and you end up having a layoff notice that you can't bump anybody, you're out the door. When and where the county posts a senior management analyst position in the future, they are obligated to first hire off that rehire list before hiring anybody else. One thing to keep in mind is that it's standard that you're not allowed to double dip on kind of layoff negotiation benefits, if that makes sense. So you couldn't both take a golden handshake and then get placed on a rehire list and get your job back. Would not normally be allowed. I know one example where I negotiated that folks could pay the money back if they wanted to come back, and that was an option. But that's non-standard in my experience. So this would largely be for someone who is actually impacted by the layoff. You'll have the ability to get rehired. Okay. Any more questions? Happy to stick around a little more. I see we have a couple of our healthcare program managers on the call. Just for anyone who hasn't seen any of the updates coming out around that, Miss Salas concluded all of her work on that. We know that there were some positive changes in there. No details to share yet, but it's currently in review by the higher ups in ESA, and then it will get sent out to any of the impacted areas for final review. And that's when I would expect that we're able to get a copy of it. It's when we've gotten copies of this study previously, which should mean hopefully we'll be wrapped up here in a matter of weeks, and we'll be able to get on that first board session in August to get implementation. So I know this has been something I've been talking about since a year and 3 months now that I've been involved in it. So it's been a long one. Thanks for sitting tight on this, folks, but it's almost wrapped up.
I need to leave into another meeting. I want to thank you all.
Yep.
I need to go.
Thanks for being here, Jim.
Great point.
Thank you all.
Okay. You want to sign off, Adam?
Yeah, and let me just, do you remember, Zeb, who that was that reached out with the provisional question? Jennifer. Hey, Jennifer, I'm going to message you real quick. If you just want to shoot me a call, I can address that issue with you right now.
Probably give her your information. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I think you're the host, so if I stop recording, it shouldn't affect anything, correct?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.